Well, here we are, it's Friday again, and this week I'm going to continue my recent trend of looking back at Kenner and Hasbro's 12-inch line of Star Wars action figures from the late 90s. And this week I thought it would be fun to take a look at one of the deluxe sets that they released as part of this line, and that is of course the Return of the Jedi Han Solo and Carbonite block. So, starting with the packaging, we can see that this is essentially oversized, even by the 12-inch line standards. This is twice the width of a normal 12-inch action figure in this line. It is mostly window display. We can still see that standard star field that was used on a lot of the early releases in this line. In the background there we can see the Star Wars logo in gold, and we have the Rebellion logo at the very bottom identifying where this character's allegiance stands, which is pretty cool. In the inner in-tray behind we can see that standard green lightsaber branding that we'd see on pretty much every scale of the Kenner 90s Star Wars figures, which is really cool to see, and it's really nice because that really helps the figures really stand out on display in this window packaging as well. The side panels are pretty consistent with the other figures in this line as well. So we have the very slim, narrow side panel, we have the Star Wars logo, we have the Starfield in the background, and we have a photograph of the character. So in this case we can see Han Solo there. On the flip side we can see the Carbonite block, which I think is a really nice touch. And when you stack these up with other figures on a shelf, it's going to be roughly consistent, although the sizing of the packaging can vary depending on the figure. Meanwhile, the reverse of the packaging is given over to one still image from The Empire Strikes Back. I think this is a really nice use of this space. It is mostly virgin, there's not much in the way of text covering this image. There's a little bit of small print at the bottom there. There's a little bit of information about what we're seeing. It actually tells us that Lando Calrissian is checking over Han Solo in the Carbonite block there, which is interesting. And then there's a little bit of bio on the right hand side. I have to say, I think this is a really nice approach. As I said, this is a huge canvas to have this image on, so it is writ large. It looks really, really good. It's fantastic on display, and it's a very striking visual image. And I think this looks really, really good. It's perhaps not the image I might have chosen for this particular release. I think maybe one from Jabba's Palace might have been more appropriate, but hey, nevertheless, this still looks really, really good. So let's start off by taking a look at the Han Solo action figure. Now, as you all already know, this line utilised the current Action Man bodies that were being used at this time, so the human characters all tended to have the same body regardless of scale, and it wouldn't take into account the variations in body shapes and styles. The sculpting for this figure though is quite interesting because this is a brand new sculpt in this line. We'd had a couple of Han Solos already, and this one is a fresh sculpt for this specific version of Han Solo from Return of the Jedi. I'm not quite sure what it is about Harrison Ford's appearance in Return of the Jedi, especially in this scene, that Kenner really took issue with, but it seems that every time we have a figure from Kenner of Harrison Ford here, it never works out well. And this 12-inch scale version is sadly no different. I don't think this is a really flattering sculpt of Harrison Ford or Han Solo from Return of the Jedi. It just looks far too craggy. It looks like he's got a slight smirk being sculpted into his face there, which is appropriate for the character, but it just comes across more of a sneer. It just doesn't look quite right. There's just lots of things about this that just doesn't work for me at all, to be honest. I'm not sure why they struggle so much, because there's been some fantastic sculpts in this line earlier on from A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, and of course in the 3 3/4 scale line. There's actually some decent sculpts in there, so I'm not sure why they always seem to struggle with this particular version of the character. But yeah, this doesn't look great to my eyes. Now, the costume here is pretty simple, but I think they've actually done a pretty nice job of replicating what we see on screen. He does have that folded shirt, which is quite nice. He's actually got these rubber chains as well, which go on his arms. Now, this will restrict articulation, as we'll see a little bit later, but I do appreciate them making this effort. I think this looks pretty cool, and it's a nice touch to have this. Sadly, there's no real shading, and there's not much in the way of detailing here, but it looks pretty nice, and it certainly does the job, and as I said, it's a nice little extra touch. As I mentioned, he does have the standard Action Man body mould or sculpt, so the hands, you will notice, are these typical gripping hands. They're pretty clunky and pretty chunky, but they can hold an assortment of different weapons and items in this grip, so they kind of cover all bases. And I have to say, I think they've done a very nice job of tailoring the actual trousers. We have that lemon striped trim there going up and down the side of the pants, which look really good. And we also have that nice fold in the centre of the leg as well. And this is, of course, a variant on his costume from A New Hope, but I think this looks really good. You'll notice at the bottom of his legs, he does have these rubber boots. These are quite nicely sculpted. They don't look too obtrusive, despite being quite clunky. The only criticism I have of these really is that they really hinder posability because he can't really stand freely. He's always going to fall over. You can't stand this figure flat. He needs to lean against something or have a stand. In terms of articulation, there's no real surprises here. He has the straight swivel at the neck, so he can spin his head 360 degrees, but there's no ball joints. We can't look up or down or anything like that. He does have the ball joints in the arms, so if you take the chains off, he would be able to kick his arms up and out, but with the chains on, as you can see, his movement is seriously restricted, as it should be, to be fair. He does have the pin swivel at the elbow, so he can spin his lower arm from side to side, and of course that does hinge to 90 degrees, which is pretty cool. He's also got another pin swivel at the wrist as well, so again that wrist can spin all the way around there 360 degrees, and it will hinge forwards and backwards a little bit as well. Now, there is something resembling a ball joint in the waist area, which does allow him a little bit of movement to move from side to side and a little bit forwards and backwards, but a lot of that movement comes from the actual hips rather than the waist. He does have hinged hips, so those legs do kick out to the side, they kick forwards and they kick backwards as well. Now, these legs sadly are the rubber legs that you would see on certain action men in the 90s, and I've never been a huge fan of these. So you can bend them, there is articulation there, but it's more through a wire and there's no actual joint to hold it in place, so they will tend to snap back into position. He also comes with a blaster rifle, which is typically associated with the Empire, with the Stormtrooper figures. This is really cool to have. I think it's really nicely sculpted and quite detailed for what it is. Now, it did have an action feature because it does actually have a missile, which is quite red and quite glaring, which just is spring-loaded into the top of the barrel there, and when you push down the scope, it would fire it. Unfortunately, mine's missing, so I can't demonstrate that to you. All in all, I kind of have mixed feelings about this Han Solo figure. There's so many things about it that are actually quite cool. I really like those chains. I really like that he comes with that blaster rifle, and he strikes a pretty imposing pose when you pose him like this. I think that's really quite cool and quite fun, and it's always great to have another Han Solo in the collection. So I think he's quite fun on a lot of ways, and certainly for the time and for the intended audience being children, I think this is absolutely fine. Obviously, looking back with adult eyes, I can definitely see there's a few misfires here, and even as a child, I always remember that likeness did bother me somewhat. Next up, we have the Carbonite block, and as you can see, this is very nicely sculpted for the time. It's actually pretty screen accurate, and there's a great amount of detail here, plus the paint apps are quite nice. It is painted in a slight metallic grey wash, so it catches the light very, very nicely, and it contrasts well against the darker paint of the Han Solo figure underneath, so I think this looks really, really good. It's got that contrast in tone, it's pretty screen accurate, and it's to scale, so this is a very nice and quite imposing extra piece to have in the collection. And on the side panels, we actually have some extra detailing here of the sort of the control panel, I suppose, that are dotted throughout either side of these panels. And this is, again, very nicely sculpted, actually a nice attention to detail here, and there's actually some individual paint apps on it as well. So all in all, this is actually quite impressive. I think they've done a really good job for this time. Now, one of the problems with this release, certainly as a child, for me was wondering what to really do with this Carbonite block, because it doesn't really do anything per se, and it doesn't add much to play. It's a nice decoration piece, and it's one of those things that I appreciate much more as an adult now, because I think it's a really cool world building extra, but as a child it did feel a little bit redundant. But it was designed with the idea that you could play with this block, and much like in the 3 3/4 scale, the idea was that you could take your Han Solo figure and stick him on the other side of the Carbonite block. Why you would do this is utterly pointless and redundant, because it's not like you can see the figure through the block, so you could just stand behind it or just not have him in there at all, and it wouldn't make much of a difference. But nevertheless, they've got two handholds that he can hold onto, and there is a space to slot his feet under, so he can snugly fit into into this block, and you can spin it around and you wouldn't necessarily know he was there, but I suppose that was part of the play. And so there you have it. There's no other action features to speak of. There's nothing really else I can draw out of this set, other than to say it's kind of an unusual one, but quite fun nevertheless. It's definitely got its downsides. As I said, I'm really not a huge fan of that portrait of Han Solo. That sculpt is less than spectacular. And I do think that the Carbonite block as a play feature is a little bit pointless. But that being said, I do think the Carbonite block is beautifully sculpted. It's a very, very nice piece. I think it would work well with any of the 1/6 scale figures that are available today, and it would look just as good. So it's perfect to put in a diorama or display. It looks very, very nice. And I think, you know, having an extra Han Solo figure in the collection is no bad thing. And I do think the tailoring, if nothing else, is pretty cool on this figure. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.